The world didn't end with a bang. It started with a whisper, an unnoticed tragedy in a small town no one cared about. A biting cold wind swept through the quiet streets of Dunwich, a town tucked away in the heartland of America. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where everyone knew each other's names. That was before the sickness. Before the dead rose. Deputy Mark Reynolds ran a hand over his stubble as he sipped from a lukewarm cup of coffee inside the sheriff's office. The night shift was always dull, but tonight, something felt off. The police radio crackled with static before a frantic voice broke through. "We gotta, Jesus, what the hell is AGH? Someone help. They're eating him. Oh God, they're..." Then silence. Mark straightened, his heartbeat quickening. He grabbed his radio. "Officer Jenkins, respond. What's your location?" "Nothing." He grabbed a shotgun, pulled on his coat, and rushed outside. The town's main street was eerily empty. The usual drunks and late-night drivers were gone. Even the diner's neon sign flickered as if struggling to stay awake. Mark's tires screeched as he sped toward the radio's last known transmission. The location? A rundown gas station on the outskirts of town. When he arrived, his headlights illuminated a nightmare. A bloodied figure stumbled toward his cruiser, arms outstretched. Its mouth hung open, revealing teeth stained red. Behind it, two more figures crouched over something, a body. They tore into it with unnatural hunger, the sound of flesh ripping louder than the engine of his car. Mark's instincts took over. He flung open his door, aimed his shotgun. "Freeze! Hands where I can see 'em." The figures didn't stop. They turned toward him, eyes clouded, jaws snapping. Then they lunged. Mark fired. The blast sent the closest one sprawling, but the others kept coming. He pumped another round, fired again. The second body collapsed. The third one, a woman with half her face missing, kept coming. She grabbed him, her grip unnaturally strong. Mark struggled, shoving his shotgun between them. She snapped her teeth an inch from his throat. With a grunt, he pulled his sidearm and fired. The bullet punched through her skull, and she went limp. Panting, he pushed her body away and turned back to the one he'd shot earlier. The first one. It was getting up. Its torso was shredded, its intestines spilling onto the pavement. And yet, it clawed toward him. Mark didn't hesitate. He aimed for the head. One shot. The body stopped moving. What the hell? A low growl made him spin. More figures emerged from the shadows, drawn by the gunfire. Their blank, hungry eyes locked onto him. Mark bolted to his cruiser, barely slamming the door shut before the first one reached him. It banged against the window, its broken nails scraping the glass. More came. They surrounded the car, moaning, clawing, pressing against the metal. His breath came in sharp gasps. This wasn't some meth head attack. This was something else. Something worse. He grabbed the radio. "Sheriff. We got a goddamn emergency." "People are," he stopped himself. "Not people. Not anymore. They're attacking. I shot one 5 times, and it kept coming till I put one in its head." Static. Then, "Deputy, it's happening here too." Mark's stomach dropped. The town was under attack. The world was changing. And the dead were walking. Mark's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his cruiser surrounded by the undead. Their hollow eyes and blood-stained mouths pressed against the glass, fingers leaving smears of crimson as they clawed hungrily at the car. He couldn't stay here. He had to move. Mark threw the cruiser into reverse, slamming his foot on the gas. The vehicle lurched backward, knocking several of the creatures to the ground. They didn't scream, didn't even flinch, just started getting back up like ragdolls on strings. He yanked the wheel to the side, fishtailing onto the main road and flooring it toward town. The radio crackled again. "God! They're everywhere! We need backup. "We need," a gunshot rang out. Then another. A brief silence, then only static. Mark cursed. That was Deputy Carson. His last transmission. As he sped through town, horror unfolded before him. People ran through the streets, screaming. Others, bleeding and disoriented, staggered aimlessly. But the worst were the ones who had already turned. A woman clutched her toddler, sobbing as she backed away from her husband, his shirt torn, his face pale, his mouth dripping red. He lunged at her, teeth sinking into her shoulder. Her scream cut through the chaos. Mark kept driving. He wanted to help, but stopping was suicide. The sheriff's station came into view. He skidded into the parking lot, throwing the car into park. The front doors were wide open. Inside, the reception area was a mess. Blood splattered the walls. A corpse in uniform slumped over the front desk, his face torn away. Mark clenched his jaw and stepped over the body, shotgun raised. "Sheriff? Anybody?" A voice from deeper inside. "Mark?" Sheriff Bill Garrison emerged from his office, his revolver raised. He looked like hell, shirt soaked in blood, his right hand wrapped in a makeshift bandage. "They got into the station," the sheriff rasped. "Damn things don't stop unless you put one in the head." Mark nodded. "I know." A scream echoed outside, followed by the crash of glass breaking. "We can't hold the station," Mark said. "This whole town's gone to hell." The sheriff's face hardened. "Then we get whoever's left and we get the hell out of here." A sudden crash from down the hall. A door slammed open. Something was coming. And they were running out of time. The sound of heavy, staggering footsteps echoed down the hall, growing louder. Mark and Sheriff Garrison exchanged a glance, both knew what was coming. Mark pumped his shotgun, stepping forward while the sheriff took aim with his revolver. A blood-soaked officer stumbled into view. It was Deputy Carson. His uniform was torn, his neck a gaping wound, his eyes clouded with death. He let out a low, guttural groan before lunging. Bang! The sheriff's revolver barked, the bullet striking Carson in the chest. It didn't stop him. He kept coming. Mark didn't hesitate. He aimed higher and pulled the trigger. The shotgun blast blew apart Carson's head, sending him crumpling to the floor. The hallway fell silent again, except for the faint moans drifting in from outside. "Headshots only," Mark muttered. Garrison wiped his brow, his hands shaking. "That was one of our own." "There's no our own anymore," Mark said grimly. "We need to move." Garrison nodded and led the way toward the armory. The door was ajar. Inside, a half-eaten deputy lay sprawled across the floor, a rifle still clutched in his dead hands. The sheriff stepped over the body and grabbed a duffel bag, stuffing it with weapons and ammo. Mark slung a shotgun strap over his shoulder and grabbed a belt of extra shells. "Where do we go?" The sheriff zipped up the bag and threw it over his back. "Main Street's overrun. We'll take the back exit, get to my truck, and head toward the highway. Maybe the next town hasn't been hit yet." They moved quickly, cutting through the back of the station. The moment they stepped outside, the cool night air was thick with the stench of blood and decay. The sheriff's pickup truck sat 20 feet away. But between them and the truck, 6 corpses. They stood motionless at first, but as soon as Mark's boot scraped against gravel, their heads snapped toward him in eerie unison. "Move fast," the sheriff growled. They sprinted. One of the corpses, a lanky man missing half his jaw, lunged at Mark. He sidestepped and smashed the butt of his shotgun into its skull. Another came for the sheriff. He fired twice, the second shot blowing out the thing's brains. Mark reached the truck first and yanked the door open. "Get in." The sheriff was right behind him, tossing the duffel bag into the back seat before jumping in. He jammed the keys into the ignition and twisted. Nothing. The engine sputtered. Mark swore. "Not now." A pair of rotting hands slammed against the window. Then another. More of them were coming. Garrison cursed under his breath and twisted the key again. The engine roared to life. He stomped the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, knocking a corpse onto the hood. It clawed at the windshield, teeth gnashing. Mark fired through the glass. The corpse's head snapped back, leaving a red smear as its lifeless body rolled off the truck. They sped out of the parking lot, weaving around abandoned cars and bodies littering the streets. The town was gone. There was no saving it. Mark exhaled, gripping the shotgun in his lap. What now? The sheriff kept his eyes on the road, jaw clenched. We find survivors. And we stay alive. Neither of them knew that the nightmare was only beginning. The sheriff's truck tore down the road, its tires screeching as it swerved around abandoned cars and lifeless bodies. Mark reloaded his shotgun, glancing at the town in the rearview mirror. Smoke rose in the distance. The streets were filled with the dead, staggering between wrecked vehicles and burning buildings. Dunwich was gone. Sheriff Garrison kept his hands tight on the wheel. Next town over is Fairview, about 20 miles from here. If they haven't been hit yet, we can find help. Mark exhaled. And if they have? Garrison didn't answer. The road ahead was dark, the headlights illuminating patches of asphalt and occasional figures wandering aimlessly. Mark aimed his shotgun out the passenger window. Think they're alive? The sheriff gritted his teeth. No. As if on cue, one of the figures turned its head sharply toward them and let out a low, guttural moan. Others followed. The truck sped past, but in the rearview, Mark saw them moving. Slowly at first. Then faster. He frowned. They're getting quicker. The sheriff's grip on the wheel tightened. Let's hope they don't start thinking too. The highway stretched into the darkness, lined with overturned cars and scattered debris. It was a graveyard of failed escapes. Bodies, some human, some not, lay slumped over dashboards or sprawled across the pavement. The further they drove, the worse it got. Then the truck's headlights landed on something ahead. A blockade. Vehicles were stacked haphazardly across the road, along with makeshift barricades of wood and metal. A lone figure stood in front, holding a rifle. Garrison slowed the truck. Could be survivors. Mark shook his head. Could be worse. The sheriff rolled the window down and raised his voice. Hey! You still human? The figure hesitated, then took a step forward. He was a wiry man, his clothes stained with blood, his eyes darting between the two of them. Depends who's a skin dot. We're from Dunwich, Mark said. Cops. Town's gone. We're looking for a safe place. The man exhaled. Ain't no such thing. Before Mark could reply, another voice shouted from behind the barricade. They followed them. They brought him here. Mark twisted in his seat. In the distance, dozens of figures were moving toward them. Slowly at first. Then faster. The wiry man's face twisted in panic. Damn it, he turned and waved frantically toward the barricade. Open up. Let him in. A large truck shifted out of the way, creating a narrow opening. Garrison floored the gas, the truck surging forward as the dead closed in. Mark fired out the window, hitting one in the skull. It dropped, but two more took its place. The sheriff's truck barreled through the gap just as the survivors pushed the barricade back into place. The second it slammed shut, a wave of undead crashed against it, clawing and moaning. Mark and Garrison jumped out, guns ready. Inside the blockade, a dozen survivors stood with weapons raised. A burly man stepped forward, a shotgun slung over his shoulder. You led those things right to us. Mark met his glare. They were coming either way. The man scowled but said nothing. The wiry man who let them in spoke up. Name's Dale. We ain't much, but we're what's left of Fairview. Garrison surveyed the survivors, men, women, even a few kids. They were tired, dirty, desperate. Mark looked past them, toward the town beyond the barricade. Smoke rose from burning houses. The streets were empty, but for how long? Fairview wasn't safe. Nowhere was. And the dead weren't stopping. Mark scanned the survivors huddled inside the barricade, exhausted faces, trembling hands gripping weapons, eyes hollowed by fear. They had been fighting for their lives long before he and the sheriff arrived. Sheriff Garrison slung his rifle over his shoulder and faced Dale. "How long you been holding out here?" Dale wiped sweat from his forehead. "Few days. Power's out, supplies are low, and those things are getting smarter." He motioned toward the barricade, where figures outside continued pressing against the makeshift walls, their grotesque moans filling the night. Mark shook his head. "Smarter?" A wiry woman named Trish stepped forward, gripping a crowbar. "At first, they just shuffled around like dumbass. But now? They group up. They track noise. I swear some of them even set a damn trap for us at the old grocery store." Garrison's face darkened. "If they're learning, this place won't hold." As if on cue, a heavy thud shook the barricade. Then another. The survivors tensed. Dale cursed. "They're trying to break through." A louder crash. Something big slammed against the barrier, causing a section of wood to splinter. Mark and the sheriff rushed to the wall, peering through the gaps. The horde outside had tripled in size. The ones nearest the barricade smashed their bodies against it while others climbed over wrecked cars to gain higher ground. But the worst was in the center. A grotesquely bloated corpse, its body swollen with rot, its skin stretched and splitting, lurched forward, its mouth twisted into something almost like a grin. Mark narrowed his eyes. "The hell is that?" Dale's face went pale. "We call 'em bloaters. Tougher, stronger, and when you shoot 'em, they..." Boom! The bloated corpse exploded, spraying black, putrid bile in all directions. The moment it touched flesh, the affected survivors screamed in agony. Their skin sizzled as the bile ate through it like acid. Panic erupted. 2 men collapsed, writhing on the ground, their flesh melting away. The others backed away, horror-stricken. The sheriff grabbed Mark's arm. "We're leaving. Now." Mark clenched his jaw. "We can't just..." A deafening crack cut him off. The barricade was failing. The horde surged forward, clawing at the opening breach. Dale fired his rifle. "Fall back." The group scattered, some retreating toward the town, others taking defensive positions behind abandoned cars. Mark pumped his shotgun and took aim. The first corpse pushed through the barricade, and he blew its head off. Another took its place. Then another. Trish screamed as one of the creatures grabbed her from behind. She swung her crowbar wildly, smashing its face in, but 2 more swarmed her. Garrison grabbed Mark. "We can't win this fight." Mark looked around. He knew the sheriff was right. The town was lost. "To the truck!" Dale shouted, motioning toward an old delivery truck parked near a gas station. The remaining survivors sprinted toward it, firing at the advancing horde. Mark and Garrison covered the rear. A corpse lunged at the sheriff, but Mark took it down with a shotgun blast. Dale jumped into the driver's seat and started the engine. "Move!" Mark and Garrison scrambled into the back as the truck lurched forward. A few survivors were still running. 1 man tripped. Before he could get up, the undead swarmed him. The doors slammed shut just as the truck sped away. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of sweat and gunpowder. Dale glanced at them in the mirror. "We're not out of this yet." Mark steadied himself. "Where are we going?" Dale's jaw tightened. "Somewhere we can actually survive." Behind them, Fairview burned. The dead had won again. The delivery truck barreled down the ruined highway, its tires screeching as it swerved past abandoned vehicles. Inside, the air was thick with exhaustion and tension. The few remaining survivors sat in silence, their faces hollow, their bodies shaking from the sheer horror of what they had just escaped. Mark sat against the cold metal wall, reloading his shotgun. Sheriff Garrison wiped sweat and blood from his face, staring out the back window. Fairview was nothing but a burning husk now, the glow of the flames still visible in the distance. Dale, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands, finally broke the silence. "We keep going till sunrise. No stops. No chances." Trish groaned from the corner, clutching a gash on her leg. "And then what?" "There's nowhere left." Dale's jaw tightened. "There's a place." Mark looked up. "What place?" Dale hesitated before answering. "A military outpost. 20 miles out, near the old airfield." Garrison frowned. "Military's gone. We haven't heard a damn thing from them since this started." "I know." Dale's grip tightened on the wheel. "But I got a brother there. If he's still alive, we got a shot." The truck rumbled on through the night, but Mark's gut told him something was off. Dale was too certain, too determined. Was he leading them to salvation, or a grave? The sheriff spoke up. "We need fuel." Dale cursed under his breath. "There's a truck stop up ahead. We get in, get what we need, and get out." Trish shook her head. "That's how people die." Dale's eyes darkened. "Sitting in this truck without gas will kill us faster." A tense silence followed. Then Mark sighed. "Fine. We make it quick." The truck stop loomed in the darkness, its neon sign flickering weakly. Rows of abandoned cars littered the lot, their doors hanging open, belongings scattered across the pavement. The place was eerily silent. Too silent. Dale pulled the truck up near the pumps and killed the engine. 5 minutes. In and out. Mark and Garrison climbed out first, weapons ready. The others followed, moving cautiously. The stench of decay was thick in the air. Dale grabbed a gas canister from the truck. "I'll siphon what I can. Watch my back." Mark nodded, scanning the lot. The silence was suffocating. There were no birds, no wind, just the occasional drip of water from a busted pipe. Then, a noise. A faint shuffle. Mark raised his shotgun. "We're not alone." A low growl echoed from inside the gas station. The glass doors exploded outward as a figure launched itself at them, faster than any zombie they had seen before. Mark barely had time to react before the creature slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. It wasn't like the others. Its body was gaunt, its movements unnervingly fast. Its mouth snapped open, rows of blackened teeth gnashing at his face. Mark shoved his shotgun up, jamming the barrel under its chin. He pulled the trigger. The blast blew its head apart, showering him in gore. "Run!" Dale shouted. More figures burst from the gas station, at least a dozen, all of them moving with terrifying speed. Trish screamed as one tackled her, sinking its teeth into her shoulder. Garrison fired, taking it down, but Trish was already bleeding out. Dale jumped back into the truck, slamming the door. "Get in or you're dead." Mark grabbed Garrison and shoved him toward the truck. The sheriff barely made it inside before Dale floored the gas. The truck sped away just as the creatures swarmed where they had been standing moments before. Mark panted, pressing a hand to his ribs. What the hell were those things? Dale's face was pale. The next stage. Mark exchanged a look with Garrison. If the dead were evolving, humanity's chances had just gotten even worse. Ahead, the road stretched into the darkness. And somewhere out there, Dale's so-called safe haven awaited. But Mark had a terrible feeling that it wasn't safe at all. The delivery truck roared down the broken highway, the engine straining as Dale pushed it to the limit. Inside, the survivors sat in heavy silence, their eyes reflecting exhaustion and despair. Trish was dead. The gas station ambush had cost them more than just fuel, it had proven that the undead were evolving. And if they could get faster, more intelligent, how long before they became unstoppable? Mark wiped a smear of blood off his face, his shotgun resting across his lap. Sheriff Garrison sat beside him, staring out the window, his mind lost in dark thoughts. Finally, Mark broke the silence. "This outpost of yours better be real, Dale." Dale kept his eyes on the road. "It's real." Mark wasn't convinced. "You sure it's not overrun? Just because your brother's military doesn't mean he's still alive." Dale didn't answer, but his grip on the wheel tightened. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a blood-red glow over the distant horizon. And then, finally, the outpost came into view. The old military installation was surrounded by towering fences, topped with barbed wire. Watchtowers loomed over the landscape, and floodlights stood dormant, waiting for nightfall. It looked intact. But it was too quiet. Dale pulled the truck up to the gate and honked the horn. "If he's here, he'll let us in." They waited. Nothing. Mark scanned the walls. No guards. No movement. Just an eerie stillness. Garrison cursed. "It's dead." Dale jumped out of the truck. "No, it's not. I know my brother, he wouldn't abandon this place." He ran to the gate, pounding on it. "Eric! It's me!" Silence. Then, click. The sound of a rifle being cocked. Mark whipped around, raising his shotgun. A lone soldier stood on top of a watchtower, aiming a sniper rifle down at them. His uniform was filthy, his face gaunt and weary. "Who the hell are you?" the soldier called. Dale's face lit up. "Eric." The soldier hesitated. "Dale." The gate creaked open, and Dale ran inside. Mark and Garrison followed, weapons still ready. Inside, the outpost was barely holding together. There were a handful of survivors, soldiers and civilians, huddled inside, all looking half-starved and exhausted. Eric climbed down from the tower, his rifle still in hand. "Jesus, Dale. I thought you were dead." Dale grinned. "Not yet." Eric glanced at Mark and Garrison. "Who are they?" "Survivors," Dale said. "They helped me get here." Eric exhaled. "Then I hope they know how to fight." A distant boom echoed through the air. Everyone turned toward the horizon. Dust clouds rose in the distance. A sound followed, a sound that made the blood in Mark's veins run cold. A chorus of moans. The dead were coming. And not just a few. Thousands. A massive, writhing horde stretched across the landscape, surging toward the outpost like a tidal wave of death. And leading them. The evolved ones. Faster. Smarter. Mark pumped his shotgun. "Looks like we make our last stand here." Eric nodded grimly. "Then let's make it count." As the first of the undead reached the gates, the survivors raised their weapons. It was time to fight. For humanity. For survival. For the end of the world.